Hello, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to 3GNY Stories Live, We Do Wednesdays. I'm David Wax, 3GNY's president and grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors. I'm thrilled to be here for our second installment of We Do Wednesday, featuring special guest speaker, Sharon Cooper. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit organization for grandchildren of survivors and their supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and the lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide a supportive forum for the descendants of survivors. Founded in 2005 with a group of 6, 3GNY's membership now exceeds 2,400. Before COVID-19, we've held diverse in-person programs, including museum tours, film screenings, theater engagements, discussion groups, book talks, volunteering with survivors, Shabbat dinners, Jewish cultural events, intergenerational gatherings, genealogy workshops, and much more. We've recently pivoted to virtual events and are proud to share our work with those of you who ordinarily wouldn't be able to attend our programs, along with our valued community members. 3GNY has helped launch 3G groups in other areas of the country. These include 3G DC and 3G NJ. Our leadership collaborates with others around the country and even around the world to share our experience and insights with them and help them get off the ground. 3GNY is most proud of its flagship educational program, WEDU, which stands for We Educate. This initiative empowers grandchildren of survivors to learn and compellingly share their families' Holocaust experiences in school classrooms and community groups. At the beginning of the year, WEDU gained support and partnership from the American Society for Yad Vashem's Young Leaderships Associates. I'd now like to introduce Alexis Fishman, 3GNY board member emeritus and educational leader who will share more about WEDU.
Hello there, everyone. My name's Alexis Fishman. I'm the grandchildren of 4 Holocaust survivors, and I'm coming to you from Sydney, Australia. It is Thursday morning. Thursday does come, and I am very excited to be here to tell you all about WEDU. Developed under the guidance of Facing History and ourselves, WEDU prepares participants to learn and teach their family stories. WEDU is a powerful contribution to Holocaust education. As the population of Holocaust survivors decline, their stories should not be lost with them. As a living link to our grandparents' stories, we are in a special position to elevate the individual experience from the collective. We create a personal connection to history. The Holocaust serves as an entry point for examining prejudice. The program actively engages students in thinking about ways to confront intolerance, prejudice, and persecution that remain with us today. As well as this, our ability to share authentic stories allows us to connect with people from different backgrounds and levels of understanding. This creates dialogue and inspires students to explore their own family history as an entry point to understanding world history. Since WEDU started in 2010, we've trained 250 speakers, visited 221 classrooms in 84 different schools, and we have reached more than 20,000 students. And we are still going. Since COVID-19 hit, we've moved our WEDU training sessions of 3Gs onto a virtual platform. We're now visiting classrooms via Zoom and working with teachers to ensure we can still make an impact, even if we cannot attend schools in person right now. We have so much more to do, and we're making it happen however we can. 3GNY is volunteer run and relies on donations to keep WEDU and many other programs going. In order for us to keep doing this critical work, your support is essential. Any amount, big or small, can help us sustain WEDU and train even more 3Gs. For example, $300 can sponsor a 3G to go through the WEDU program. $3,600 can sponsor an entire WEDU class. There is a link to our donation page in the chat box, and we hope you'll consider making a gift. Thank you for helping us honour the memory of our grandparents and ensuring that never again is more than just a token phrase. In just a moment, you'll have a chance to see WEDU in action through a personal story. I am thrilled to introduce Sharon Cooper, who is a shining example of WEDU's success and a frequent visitor to school classrooms. Sharon is a grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors. She holds an MBA from Fordham University and a BS in marketing from American University. She's currently the Director of Marketing for the Cliffs Climbing and Fitness, as well as being a marketing consultant. I will also say that Sharon and I spent time together as board members of 3GNY, and it is my pleasure to have been asked to introduce her tonight. Please welcome Sharon Cooper.
Thank you so much, Alexis. Thank you, Dave. And thank you, 3GNY, for giving me this opportunity and this platform to share something that is so important and special to me. And thank you, everybody, for joining. When I was young, the Holocaust wasn't talked much about in my family. My grandparents, my mom's parents, didn't talk about it much to her, and therefore, she didn't talk about it much to me. All I knew is that they were Holocaust survivors. I started to learn about the Holocaust in Hebrew school. And when I was about 8, I watched one of those horrific Holocaust movies that tells you what really happened. I was horrified. I broke down and I cried for days. I couldn't believe that the grandparents I knew and loved so much, the ones that would give me extra ice cream when they were babysitting, when mom and dad weren't around, that they had gone through such trauma. And to try and fathom what they had lived through was pretty difficult. In the 90s, director Steven Spielberg funded interviews to visit Holocaust survivors, document their stories. Luckily, both of my grandparents took this opportunity, and we were lucky enough to have their survival documented online. My grandmother survived Auschwitz. I remember being 5 and asking her what that tattoo of numbers were on her arm. She kind of said like it was something, like it was the pirates, and just rubbed it off. My grandfather, he survived many different work camps throughout Poland and had an awful experience. Later in my life, I watched my grandparents' testimonial and got the guts to start asking questions. About 6 years ago, I had an urge to keep their story alive. My grandmother had passed away, my grandfather still alive. But I knew he wouldn't live forever, and eventually it would be up to me to keep their story alive, never forget, and make sure it doesn't happen again. I started Googling for a way I could get involved and found the absolute perfect organization to make my mark. I went through WEDU training and was lucky enough to work for supporting businesses who welcomed my desire to chop up the workday every so often and run to a school in the middle of the day to tell my grandfather's story and connect with students. I've had the most welcoming experiences from students and teachers around New York City, including follow-up letters of appreciation from entire classrooms. You can tell from those letters that they truly listened to every word I said. And with that, I'd like to share with you the story that I tell when I visit classrooms around New York City. I like to start out by asking who celebrates a holiday in December, whether it be Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, anything at all. Most hands usually go up. Have you ever been ashamed of celebrating this holiday? Afraid that your neighbors would find that you had a Christmas tree? Think twice before posting on Facebook. No, you probably had a Christmas tree in the window and took pictures of the beautiful ornaments and decorations. My dad grew up similar, celebrating Hanukkah in an exciting way. Menorah in the window, excited to celebrate this holiday where you get 8 presents, 1 for each night. However, when my mom celebrated Hanukkah growing up, it was different. Before pulling out the menorah that would represent the fact that they were Jewish, my grandfather would first close the blinds and the curtains to ensure that nobody in the neighborhood knew that they were celebrating this holiday, showing that they were Jewish. Because my grandfather not only survived an absolutely horrific time in his life where he was victimized and tortured, but watch as his mother, father, brother, sisters, aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, and cousins be led to gas chambers because of the mere fact that they were Jewish. Somehow a sheer miracle of willpower, immense amount of strength, and luck allowed my grandfather to be one of the only 7 members of his entire 78-person family to survive. 71 were killed. My grandfather lived a normal life just like you and I. He lived in the second largest city in Poland called Lodz. He went to school, liked to play soccer, until one day, things started to slowly change at first, and then drastically change. My grandfather used to tell the story as one day the Germans walked down the street like a parade, and they slowly took away the rights of the Jewish population. The first rule: if you see a German walking on the sidewalk, you must step off the sidewalk onto the street. Second rule: Jews must turn in all radios. And in a time of war, radios were extremely important. There was no internet or Facebook to keep up to date on what was going on in the world. Third rule: Jews can only have a certain amount of cash. Fourth rule: Jews cannot take public transportation. Fifth rule: Jews must wear a yellow star. If you did not follow any of these rules, the consequence was not jail or a slap on the wrist, it was death. Then one night, late in November, there was a knock at the door. Every Jewish door. My grandfather and his family were told to get dressed, take as many belongings as they can carry, and be out the door at the train station in 15 minutes. So the family had no choice but to follow orders. They walked outside down the street, but then were told, wait, never mind, the cattle cars are full. And my grandfather, along with his family, were ordered to return to their home, and the Germans would be back tomorrow. About a couple years ago, 13 second and third generation survivors of my family took a roots trip to trace back my grandfather's history. We went back to Poland, to Lodz, where he grew up, the death camps, the labor camps, which I will reference a little bit later on. Here is the building we went back to where my grandfather grew up, Limanoskova 6. You can see my mom standing in front of the building, and this street here that's shown on the right, you know, that was the street that they went to when they were lined up for cattle cars. However, they went back inside, and my grandfather said, this is enough. We're not waiting until tomorrow to see where they take us. So the next day, they headed out to the countryside to a small town called Benglashin, which took a couple days by horse and buggy to get there. My grandfather's aunt lived there with her family and a few cousins. They figured they would be safe out there from the war and chaos, and they were for a little while. Life out in the country wasn't great. There was definitely limited resources, but they were kind of in the middle of nowhere. So considering it was a time of war, things weren't so bad. Then in June of 1941, my grandfather had to do forced labor. He was taken to work 12 to 14-hour days, shoveling wet sand into wheelbarrows in order to help the irrigation system. Like I said before, he was active, he played soccer, so he could handle the work and the labor he was doing. But getting into the winter months, standing in wet sand, knee height all day, was the least bit pleasant. One of the closest death camps to where my grandfather was Treblinka. Treblinka is the second largest death camp to Auschwitz. Almost 1 million Jews were killed there. There was a man who was working there, a Jew who was one of the very few to not be killed in the gas chambers, and he was ordered to sort through all the clothing from the Jews, looking for jewelry. He happened to try and escape. He jumped into a wheelbarrow of clothes, which was then put onto a train, and he then jumped from the train as it was moving. He showed up where my grandfather was, in this little town of Benglashin, and told everybody what was going on at the death camps at Treblinka. Usually when I'm in a classroom in front of people, I like to pose the question to kids and ask, what do you think he thought? And some kids will answer, he must have been scared or frightened or not know what to do. And sometimes, a lot of the times, there's somebody in the classroom who answers and says, he didn't believe them. And that answer is absolutely correct. My grandfather and all of his friends thought that this man was absolutely delusional. If we think about it today, if somebody came into the classroom or your home and said, everybody with red hair, everyone with glasses, everyone who's short is being sent to gas chambers, we just wouldn't believe him or them. And that's what happened back then as well. Unfortunately, this man was absolutely right. And a few short months later, there was another knock at all the Jewish doors in town. Everyone had to be ready with everything they could carry. Many people, many younger people, were offered to be hidden by non-Jews in the area. And then very quickly it came out that if you were hiding in a Jew, your entire family would be shot. So this group of people that was about 50 of the Jews in the town quickly grew to 90 because all of a sudden people who were supposed to be hidden had nowhere to go. My grandfather and his family were then loaded onto an army truck, taken to an unknown place. After bribing the guard on the truck with some jewelry and asking, "Are we going to be taken into the forest and be shot?" the guard responded, "No, but considering where you're going, you will have wished that you would have been shot." At this point, we are fairly certain that most of my grandfather's family was sent to Treblinka. You can see here we visited on top, there's a few memorial stones. On the bottom right, you can see where a lot of the bodies were burned from what we were told. There's not much left here to resemble what happened. And on the bottom left is the picture of everybody who's on the trip, except for me since I was taking the picture. And we walked around here, we walked these steps knowing that my great-grandparents walked these steps to their death. My grandfather, his sister Edja, and a few cousins who were deemed more fit for work were taken to Skarziska Kamienda, and upon arrival, they were told and ordered to give up any valuables, any jewelry that they had. My grandfather had some jewelry sewn into his clothes, and he didn't give up the jewelry, which actually later came on to save his life. When they arrived, the men and women were separated. My grandfather was sent to Camp B with his cousins Joseph and Adam, while his sister Edja was sent to Camp A. Life here was extremely tough to survive. My grandfather was left with the clothes on his back, and luckily he had one long coat to keep him warm. On a typical day, he worked 13 hours. He was woken up at 4 a.m., as he would put it, given a black liquid that some would consider coffee. There was a half-hour break at 11 a.m. where he was given turnip soup, consisting mostly of water, and at night a quarter loaf of bread. Now, if you're lying in bed sick all day, this is not enough food to survive on, let alone the fact that they were working 13 hours a day. He says that people would literally drop like flies after 2 weeks of starvation, and he was constantly seeing new faces. We visited here, and there's like a little bit of remnants of an ammunition factory. That was what was there then, that's what's there now. It's still being used. Many of the buildings were bombed out. And it was a little disappointing to see basically nothing left, where tens of thousands of Jews, including my family members, had been killed. And on the right, there is a little bit of a memorial that has a cross on it and doesn't mention anything of Jews. So that was a little disappointing to see. We were told that, or there's a book about this place that talks about the fact that it was cheaper just to buy more Jews than to feed the ones and keep alive that they had. So 2 weeks after arriving at this camp, my grandfather's cousin Joseph became ill and he couldn't get out of bed. There was a typhus epidemic going on around that camp that he had caught. So my grandfather and his cousin Adam, Joseph's older brother, left him to rest for the day and said, "We'll be back later." And my grandfather put that one long coat that he had over Joseph. They came back later that day to find a guard wearing the coat, and Joseph wasn't there. That's when they found out the policy. If you can't get out of bed, whether it be from weakness caused by starvation, overworked, typhus, you were taken to Barrack 7. Barrack 7, anyone in Barrack 7 was tossed onto a daily truck that came to pick up anybody who couldn't make it to work and brought directly to the already prepared mass graves and shot. A few months later, my grandfather was struck with typhus as well. He was woken up by his cousin Adam, who had just lost his younger brother, Joseph, to typhus. Adam basically carried my grandfather to roll call, and this is where the jewelry came in to save his life. He would have been sent to Barrack 7, but they bribed a guard with the jewelry so that he could, as he put it, lay in a shed like a dog for a couple days until his fever broke. And that's how he survived not going to Barrack 7. Every other Sunday, my grandfather and his cousin Adam were allowed to go over to Camp A, where his sister Edja happened to be, because they had showers there. Every other week, his sister would wait there with a little bit of extra bread that she could salvage to try and save it for them. And she would wait there, waiting to see if they had survived another 2 weeks, waiting to see if they would show up for their showers. After my grandfather had typhus, his sister Edja literally didn't recognize him. That's what bad shape he was in. My grandfather was later brought to several other work camps with similar horrifying conditions, including Buchenwald. Towards the end of the war, he witnessed the Germans starting to burn all of the mass graves where they had buried the Jews like bricks, trying to destroy the evidence of the horror that they had created. Eventually, he was liberated from Theresienstadt, and he says that the first time he saw civilization and people in regular clothes, it was like seeing a movie in color for the first time. He had been wearing and living black and white for so long, seeing normalization was like a mirage. He traveled back to Lodz, the city where he had grown up, to see if any of his family members had survived. By this point, he had been separated by everybody. He went back to the building that he grew up to see if there was any family memorabilia. The door was slammed in his face. In the town, there was a church with a huge white wall that people would go to and write their names on it for other families to go see and see if they recognized any names. So he went there and he didn't see any names that he recognized. A couple of days later, he actually ran into his sister Edja on the street to find that she was the only other member of his immediate family that had survived the Holocaust. I used to ask him what it was like when he saw her for the first time, and he said that they were just completely speechless. He went to a displaced persons camp, Landsberg, for several years after that, where he met my grandmother and had their first baby. My aunt, who slept in a suitcase as her crib, so you know things were still really tough at that point. And they then made the tough immigration to America, where my mom was born. And you'll see here on this slide pictures of my grandmother and grandfather. On the left, a long time ago, on the right, kind of more so as I knew them. And the next slide shows my grandfather with his 2 daughters. My mom is on the right. And on the right picture, you'll see my grandfather with his sister Edja. She lived in Vienna for her life. But every Friday at 2 p.m. New York time, he would call Vienna at 8 p.m. right after Shabbat dinner, so they would catch up. And the next slide is just some family pictures from my bat mitzvah. You can see my grandfather and I, my sister's bat mitzvah. And the next slide just showing like the amazing times that we had. My sister and I dancing with my grandfather at weddings, celebrating birthdays. And the bottom right picture is really cool because that shows my grandfather with many of his great grandchildren. So I wanted to show these pictures just to show the next miracle of his life, that he was able to create a sense of normalcy, created a life here for himself and his family, his descendants in America, after surviving the unthinkable. He passed away on November 12th, 2016. He lived until he was 97. And he still had nightmares about this horrible experience until the day that he died. So I ask 3 things of you today. First, please always be grateful for what you have. As little or as horrible as it may seem at the moment, it could always be so much worse. I have friends that have commented that I'm a positive person, which kind of comes easy, knowing what my grandparents lived through. Nothing that happens in my life will ever begin to compare to what they endured and what they survived. Second, stand up against intolerance and injustice against anyone. It's still very prevalent in the world today. And even when it doesn't sound that bad, it grows. Third, please never forget my grandfather's story and the horrors that he lived through. It's up to you and I to keep his story alive. And with that, I want to bring it full circle. And I just want to share a quick clip. This is the end actually of his 2-hour Spielberg documentary that he filmed on his entire story. You know, this is like a quick, brief overview. The full story is available online. And I just wanted to share a quick clip from that, just sharing his message to me and his grandchildren that I want to share with you.
Poland. Okay. Behind me is Andrea, mother of these two lovely children.
I just wanted to say that I'm very proud of my father for coming to this country, and my mother too, coming here with nothing and building a life and a home for all of us. And I'm glad he made this tape to fill in the gap in the future so that my children will, excuse me, will know what went on in their grandpa's lifetime and what life was like for him, as unpleasant as it may have been.
I love you, Grandpa. I love you, Grandpa.
I know.
What message would you like to leave for your grandchildren? What would you like to tell them? What did you learn? What could they learn?
I would like to say to my grandchildren that whatever I told them here, this is exactly what happened, and I hope that it will never happen again in anybody's lifetime.
Thank you, Sharon. Incredibly moving, important story, and we really appreciate you being here to share that with us. We do have a couple of questions that have come through on our chat, and I will ask everybody and anybody, if you've got any questions, please don't be shy, put them in the chat so that we can pass them on to Sharon. So the first question is, can you share a little bit more about your trip to Poland, including how it felt to be in the exact same spots that you knew your grandfather lived?
Yeah, it was really eerie. It was really cool to go back, but everywhere I went, it was an unreal experience. I mean, on this trip, I couldn't feel like I could say the words that I was cold or I was hungry, just knowing what he had lived through when we were there. And I think it was a little bit disappointing to see a lot of what he endured and went through. It wasn't memorialized at all, and people kind of didn't really care so much what happened, and that was a little bit disappointing. But it was an unreal, moving experience to see and experience firsthand what he lived through. And his photographic memory gave us the exact directions to go, every single place, hand-drawn maps and everything.
Amazing. And how did you learn all of the details of his story? Was it just from his testimony, or were you able to talk to him and maybe fill in some of those gaps too?
Yeah, later in life, I just got up the guts to keep asking some questions, and watching his testimonial was the first thing, talking to him more, asking him questions. And then one day, actually, we set up a family meeting on a Sunday. There was a few other of my family members, second and third generation. We sat there for 5 hours around the table with him, and he just gave us all of the details, but I'm pretty sure that he saved us from the gruesome ones. I just know that it was so much worse than the way that he described it.
After witnessing such horror, how did your grandfather still believe in God? You mentioned that he celebrated Shabbat. The question is how, in your opinion?
Yeah. I don't know. That's a great question. And I don't think I ever asked him that. I think it was something that we just kind of moved on and kept believing in. Yeah.
How old was your grandfather when he arrived at the camps, and how old was he when he left?
He was about 15 when he arrived and about 17 or 18 when he left. So he was really that prime age, and he was in really good shape too. He was a soccer player. So I think that really made him one of the lucky ones to be able to endure the intense labor that he went through. Anybody younger or much older, there was, a lot of his family members, there was just no way for them to be able to survive that.
How do you think your grandparents' experience affected the upbringing of you and your family?
Yeah, I think that, I'm sure deep down, I know for sure that it affected them immensely. Like I mentioned, my grandfather, he did admit that he had nightmares about it until the day that he died. And I think they suppressed a lot of that to do their best to bring up a normalcy of family. And I think that's where, a lot of families deal with it differently. A lot of families talk about it a lot. A lot of families might not talk about it as much. But I'm really lucky to have the opportunity that he lived until 97, and I could be older and live with him and ask him those questions that I felt like I never got answers to.
What precipitated the family decision to visit Poland, and how old were you when you were there?
Yeah, I think actually my mom and her cousins, and like any of the descendants of those 7 family members, they always have this need and this want to go back and know where their roots are, right? My mom and everybody her age in the family, none of them had grandparents. Like that's like a weird feeling to never feel like you knew where you came from. And I think that trip stemmed from their desire to learn where they came from and what they missed out on and how life was changed, and see, you know, where their grandparents were perished. And for me, I was always at that point fascinated and trying to learn more about what happened. And that's kind of how the trip happened. I will say that my grandfather, he was just like, I'm not really sure why you're going. There's nothing left there. There's nothing to see. You know, that was the past and an awful part of his history and his life experience that he truly, truly wanted to leave behind. And, you know, at that point he probably could have come, but he had no interest in going. But I will say, like, coming back after that trip, it's on, like, I think we all were just in a daze for a couple weeks after what we experienced, and just truly being thankful for everything that we have coming back to New York.
And how old were you? I don't think we heard that.
It was probably 27 or 28.
Mm-hmm. And how old was your grandfather when he moved to the United States?
He was about 19 or 20 at that time.
And what was his profession?
So he actually, in the displaced persons camp in Lodz, he was the chief of police. And when he came to New York, he was working in a manufacturing company.
Are there any family heirlooms that survived?
We have a few pictures. And some of those pictures, like, we don't even know where necessarily they came from. I think they might have been like from friends of friends that were being hidden at some point. So that's probably like the heirlooms that we hold on to. We have a picture of my great grandparents, which is like unbelievable that we even have this picture.
This is not a question, but this is from cousin Larry, who accompanied you on the Roots trip to Poland. Cousin Larry says, I think I was the first one that he shared the story with so many years ago. He told the story so accurately, and you have conveyed his story very well. So that's a thanks from cousin Larry. And here's another question. Did your grandparents experience further discrimination after coming to the States? And have you experienced any discrimination for your beliefs? Question from Jackie.
Yeah, I think them coming to New York and me living in New York, we haven't experienced a great amount. I think for them, like when I talk about in the beginning and the menorah, I think they kept completely secret the fact that they were Jewish because of what they had lived through. But I will say, I mean, going back to Poland, I think that we did like see graffiti on things, or on like Jewish stars graffitied in places. And so that was kind of experienced back then in Poland, which was just like weird to see and experience when you're going back and visiting these labor camps and these death camps.
Which DP camp was he in? Do you know?
He was in Lodz.
Right. And do you know as much about your grandmother's story as you do about your grandfather's?
I know a decent amount about my grandmother's. Yeah, she was from the Czech Republic. She survived Auschwitz. You know, had an unbelievable experience. Her sister survived almost until the end with her, but her sister had given up her babies at that point and, you know, died just before the end. And, you know, my grandmother died when I was about 5 or 6, so I didn't have the opportunity to speak with her, but we do have her testimonial online that I've watched a couple times.
What is the legacy that you hope to pass on to the next generation, you know, about your grandfather's and your grandmother's story and history?
I think like the strength that lives within our family. You know, there were so many times when he was so close to being murdered, like he's had guns held to his head during this time. And if any of that had happened, or one thing had gone wrong, or he didn't have this immense amount of luck to survive, I wouldn't be here today. And future generations of the family wouldn't be here today. So I think knowing and appreciating what he lived through and endured and survived is really important for us all to keep in mind. And of course, making sure that it doesn't happen again.
Okay. I think we've got one last question, unless there's some more that come through quickly. There's a question from someone about what Lodz is like. And I imagine that's sort of from your experience in the trip back to Poland.
Yeah, I think Lodz was like your typical European city. I mean, it was weird for me. I remember going for a run in the morning with my cousin Ben one day, and it just like, it almost felt weird or felt guilty for going for a run and almost like enjoying that one piece of the morning. So I felt like, to me, it was just an entire like awful memory that my grandfather had of this place. But the city itself, if I wasn't going with a specific memory, would have probably been lovely.
Okay, this I think will be our last question. There seems to be a resurgence of anti-Semitism worldwide, including on US college campuses. Does that frighten you, and have you ever come face to face with it?
It's extremely frightening. I think the rise in anti-Semitism recently in past years is extremely troubling, and my grandfather experienced probably a couple months of it before he passed away. And, you know, I think one thing that he says, and, you know, we experience this in the story, right? You start out by saying there's just a couple rules, right? They took away the rights of the Jewish people slowly. And that's how people don't notice it at first. And I think that's where this rise in anti-Semitism at college campuses, to the specific question, is very concerning. And I think that I think that that's what we hope to do by WEDU, is educating people, right? Jews and non-Jews, on what happened, what our grandparents lived through, and hoping that that kind of education will allow people to understand and suppress the anti-Semitism.
Thanks, Sharon. That's a good note to end on. I suppose the idea that these things start small, and, you know, WEDU's hope is to be able to kind of educate people to notice them and do what they can to squash those small injustices before they become too big. So we want to thank you so much, and thank you also to everyone for tuning in. It was a really, really moving, brilliant presentation. So thank you from everyone. And we are going to throw back to 3GNY President Dave Wax.
Wow. Sharon, thank you so much for joining this event and being such an impactful speaker in so many classrooms. Alexis, thank you for sharing the details about WEDU with us and for all your hard work leading 3GNY's educational initiatives and other programming. Thank you to all the viewers, wherever you may be, for joining us tonight. We're glad you took the time to hear Sharon's story, a story that must never be forgotten. I also want to let you know we are actually launching a fundraiser tomorrow to help support our WEDU program with a goal of $30,000. If you haven't yet made a gift, we hope you'll consider making one now. Please refer to the chat box for a link to our donation page. Thank you. We hope to see you again soon. We have some interesting virtual events coming up, including WEDU Wednesdays every 2 weeks. Our next one on Wednesday, August 5th, features Shelley Rude-Wernick from 3GDC, who will share her grandfather's story. In October 1939, the Germans invaded Poland and forced their way into Shelley's grandfather's Warsaw apartment. Her grandpa's life was spared then, but this moment launched a period of forced labor, hiding, concentration camp, disease, and profound destruction and loss. We'll be sending out an email with details on these events and more. Thanks so much again for taking the time out of your evening to be with us. Have a great night.